She was 73 years old, and she was standing on the sidewalk outside 240 West 84th Street with one blue suitcase, two cardboard boxes, and $530 in her checking account. The September sky above Manhattan was white and direct, not soft like winter light, not brutal like August, just present, just light without warmth yet decided. Maggie Holt looked up at the 8th floor. The terrace plants were still there. She could see them from the street. The trailing pothos, the ceramic pot of rosemary she had grown from a cutting her mother gave her 30 years ago. The fern she had carried home from a market on Columbus Avenue in 2003 wrapped in newspaper because the morning was cold and she didn't want it to shock. She had watered those plants every Thursday morning for 29 years. They belonged to Serena now. Maggie looked at them for a moment longer than she intended. Then she looked down at the suitcase. The same blue suitcase she and Thomas had taken to the Shenandoah Valley every year for the better part of 2 decades, the zipper worn smooth on one side from Thomas's habit of opening it with one hand while holding his field notes in the other. She had never replaced it because replacing it had never seemed necessary. It seemed necessary now, but for different reasons than she would have expected. She was not crying. She had done the crying. There is a finite amount of crying available to a person in a given season of grief. And Maggie Holt had used hers in the 3 months between the afternoon of the phone call and this morning. And now what remained was something quieter and more durable. Not resignation. Something closer to the feeling you have when a long calculation finally resolves. Not happiness exactly, but the particular stillness of a completed thing. She waited for the cab she had called 4 minutes ago. She did not look up at the 8th floor again. Thomas Albright Holt had walked into Dreyer's Pharmacy on Main Street in Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, on a Thursday afternoon in June of 1971, and asked for an antifungal cream for a rash he had picked up surveying a watershed in the George Washington National Forest. He was 24 years old, finishing his graduate work in forestry at Virginia Tech, and he had the hands of someone who spent more time outdoors than in large, careful hands with soil worked into the creases that no amount of washing fully removed, which Maggie would later come to think of as the hands of a man who understood that some things are meant to stay with you. She was 23, working the pharmacy counter 5 days a week, and she had been watching a particular oak tree outside the dispensary window her entire shift because it was the kind of June afternoon when the light fell through old growth at an angle that made everything look like something worth painting. Thomas walked in, stated his need with the directness of someone who did not waste words, and then stood at the counter while she went to the back room to locate the correct medication. And when she returned, he was looking out the window at the oak tree. He said without turning around, without having been asked anything, "Do you know an oak like that takes 80 years to reach that size?" Maggie set the medication on the counter. She looked at the tree. She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I grew up watching it." He turned then, and whatever he saw in her face when he turned, she never asked him, and he never fully explained it, though. He tried once late in their marriage on a night when the city was quiet and they were sitting together without needing to fill the silence. Whatever he saw, it was enough. He came back the following week with a minor complaint about a scratch. The week after that with a handwritten list of vitamins. The third week, he simply walked in, went directly to the counter, and said, "I'd like to ask if you'd be willing to have coffee with me after your shift. There's a place nearby that makes a very good apple pie." Her mother said she shouldn't go alone. Her grandmother said she should run. Maggie went. The courtship lasted 2 years. Letters written on lined paper and folded into thirds because Thomas did not own envelopes. Weekend bus trips from Blacksburg to Harper's Ferry that left him arriving with mud on his boots and field notes in his jacket pocket, which he would set on the porch railing while they talked until midnight. And her father coughed pointedly from inside the house to indicate their hour. Thomas talked about forests the way other men talked about sports, with a specificity and passion that indicated genuine devotion rather than performed interest. He talked about the systematic devastation of the American woodland over the last century. He talked about reforestation as an act of repair. He talked about species that most people had never heard of, with the tenderness usually reserved for old friends. Maggie listened, not out of politeness. She asked questions because she genuinely wanted to understand the answers. And Thomas, who had spent most of his academic life talking to people who nodded without listening, noticed the difference immediately. He told her once years later that this was what had done it. Not her face, not her patience, not even the way she had answered him about the oak tree that first afternoon, though all of those things were real. It was the fact that she actually wanted to know. They married in March of 1973. A Methodist church in Harper's Ferry. Fewer than 50 guests. Thomas wore the only suit he owned, gray slightly loose at the shoulders. Maggie wore a dress her mother had sewn over 3 months with lace at the collar and satin buttons down the back. The photos came out slightly soft because the photographer was her father's brother-in-law and had been nervous about the light. She kept all of them. They moved to New York that summer. Thomas had accepted a position with a federal reforestation program working in the Appalachian Corridor and the Mid-Atlantic Highlands, cataloging degraded zones, drafting recovery plans, doing the slow and largely invisible work of putting back what had been taken. They lived in Queens first in a 2-bedroom apartment with windows that looked onto another building's wall, and a kitchen barely large enough for 2 people to stand in at once, which Maggie transformed over the following months with plants on the windowsill and a floral tablecloth her mother had given them as a wedding gift, and a very specific arrangement of the pantry that made the space feel intentional rather than cramped. Harlan was born in 1975. Clifton in 1978. Maggie left her administrative work at the dental clinic where she had been employed since their arrival and did not return to formal employment, which was a decision she made without drama and without, as she would acknowledge much later, and only to herself, having fully examined whether it was what she actually wanted. She had been raised in a house where the mother was always present at breakfast, at school pickup, at dinner. That model was what she carried, and she carried it without question and without visible regret. And if there was something underneath it that went unexamined for a long time, that was also part of the life she lived. Her sons were different from each other in ways that became more pronounced as they grew. Harlan was the more difficult of the two, not in any simple or easily categorized way, but in the way that intelligent children are sometimes difficult, which is to say that his intelligence ran faster than his judgment, and he used it primarily to negotiate. By the time he was 10 years old, he was arguing the terms of his own punishments with a skill that left Maggie simultaneously irritated and secretly impressed. He became a lawyer, which Thomas said without any apparent irony was the most natural outcome imaginable. Clifton was quieter and easier day to day. But what Maggie eventually came to identify in him, it took years and a precision of observation she had cultivated over a lifetime, was a quality she could only describe as genuine indifference. Not cruelty. He was never cruel. But an authentic capacity to care very little about anything that did not directly affect his own life, and that included his mother, his father, the stories she told at dinner, the things she mentioned that mattered to her. He listened with a neutral face and answered with the minimum number of words the situation required. He became a financial analyst, which Thomas also said was entirely natural, also without irony. Together, the two brothers formed a combination that looked complementary from the outside, but functioned in practice as a single instrument. Decisions were made by Harlan, ratified by Clifton's silence. Maggie had no illusions about her sons. She knew them with the particular and sometimes unbearable clarity that comes from having raised a person from infancy, knew their blindnesses and their ambitions and their fears, dressed up as practicality. She loved them with a love that did not require reciprocity to sustain itself. This is perhaps the most painful variety of love that exists, because it does not diminish in proportion to the disappointment it absorbs. Thomas over the years advanced through the Forest Service and into independent consulting work that took him frequently into the field, Virginia, West Virginia, the Appalachian Corridor. He had devoted his professional life to understanding. He was gone most weekends, sometimes a week at a time, occasionally two. Maggie had not questioned this for most of their marriage because it was his work, and his work had always been like this. And she trusted him in the way that a long marriage either produces trust or collapses, and theirs had not collapsed. But there were things she noticed. His work trousers came home with sawdust, not mud. The boots of a field ecologist come back dirty in a particular way, ground in organic, the residue of wet soil and forest undergrowth. The sawdust was different. Sawdust is the product of cutting, of shaping, of building something. She noticed the rolls of film he sometimes brought to the pharmacy for developing, not the digital camera he used for official documentation, but the old 35mm he had owned since graduate school, and picked up himself in sealed envelopes he never opened in front of her. She noticed the afternoon Harlan passing through Thomas's study stopped and asked what the blueprints spread across the desk were for, and Thomas closed the folder before his son could read the header, and said with a casualness that was slightly too practiced, "Work stuff, nothing interesting." She noticed the toolbox that traveled with him sometimes, a hammer, a timber chisel, a level, which struck her as unusual for an environmental engineer whose work, as she understood it, was observational and analytical rather than constructive. She filed these observations in the part of herself where things are kept that do not yet have explanations. She was good at waiting. She had always been good at waiting. Her grandmother had called it patience, but Maggie knew it was something more specific than patience. It was the capacity to hold a question without demanding that it resolve before its time. The one exception was a night in July of 2004. It was past 2 in the morning. Thomas's side of the bed was empty, which was not unusual when he was restless, and Maggie had learned over decades of marriage to register his absence the way you register a change in barometric pressure, as information, not alarm. She got up and found him on the apartment terrace, sitting in the metal chair he preferred, with a glass of bourbon and the particular quality of stillness she associated with him when he was thinking through something long and complicated. The city was doing what New York does at 2 in the morning. Not sleeping exactly, but breathing at a different register. The distant percussion of a truck on Amsterdam Avenue. The orange geometry of lit windows in the buildings across the way. The smell of the night coming through the ginkgo trees on the street below. She sat down next to him. She did not ask what he was thinking about. 30 years of marriage had taught her that some things arrive in their own time and that asking accelerates nothing. Thomas looked at the city for a while longer. Then he said without turning to look at her, "When I'm gone, don't let them sell the forest." Maggie waited. What forest? The one I'm tending. She wanted to ask more. The questions were right there. Which forest? Where? What have you been doing? Why haven't you told me? What does it look like? But something in his voice stopped her. Not sadness, not secrecy. something she recognized, though she had never heard it in quite this configuration. The voice of a man who has run a long calculation and arrived at a result he trusts completely, a fullness, a satisfaction without performance. She stayed quiet. He did not explain further. She never forgot that night. The Upper West Side apartment they had moved to in the early 90s had 3 bedrooms and a bookshelf in the living room that Thomas had built himself on a Sunday afternoon, with tools he brought up from the storage unit in the basement, and a kitchen with a central island that Maggie used for the Sunday lunches that remained the family's fixed ritual until both sons married and their lives became architecturally incompatible with regular attendance. The apartment had 2,400 square feet and windows that looked out over the street, and a terrace where Maggie grew over the years, a small civilization of plants that she tended with the same methodical care she applied to everything that required maintenance and attention. It was a life that worked, not a life of great drama, not a life of obvious romance, a life of good routine which Maggie had come to understand was its own kind of richness. The Tuesday quilting class she had attended for 22 years in a group of neighborhood women. The Thursday visits to the branch library on 81st Street. The Saturday farmers market on Columbus Avenue where she chatted with a man named Bellamy, who had run the fruit stand for 40 years and knew the name of every regular customer. Thomas was often away. When he was home, he was present in the particular way of someone who brings the best of himself to the space that matters most. Not theatrical about it, not announcing it, just genuinely there in a way that filled the rooms. She had 2 memories that she carried with the clarity distinct from the rest, the sharpness that only the most important things maintain, where the temperature and the smell and the weight of your own body in the moment are all still accessible when you close your eyes and return to them. The first was Christmas of 1993, when Harlan was 18 and Clifton 15, and the family still fit around the kitchen table without effort. Thomas had returned from a field trip with wild forage fruit arranged in a ceramic bowl at the center of the table. Pawpaws and service berries and late-season persimmons, and the evening had that rare quality of nights when no one is in a hurry to leave, when the conversation goes long and the laughter comes easily, and time seems to have suspended itself as a small courtesy. At the end of the night, standing at the sink, washing dishes together, while the boys had retreated to the living room, Thomas had said in the voice he used for things larger than they appeared on the surface, "This is the best Christmas I've ever had." The second was an August morning in 2016. They had woken early for no reason and walked to the bakery on Broadway and drunk their coffee sitting on the stoop outside with the morning sun coming in from the side and a stray dog stopping in front of them to assess their pastries. They gave it a piece of cornbread and it left without acknowledgement. Thomas talked about a new project. Maggie talked about a book she was reading. Nothing of consequence happened. But sitting there on that white plastic chair on a Manhattan stoop, Maggie had felt something she could not name in the moment and spent months afterward identifying. It was a quiet certainty, uncomplicated, and complete, the sense that she was exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to be doing, with exactly the right person beside her. Not a feeling she had chased or constructed, one that had simply arrived the way the truest things arrive without announcement. Thomas died in November of 2020, a massive cardiac event, the attending physician said, using the clinical language that is designed to impose precision on things that resist it. He was 73 years old, and he was alone on a dirt road outside of Staunton, Virginia, doing a species survey in the Allegheny Highlands, and a farmer on a motorcycle found him and called emergency services. And by the time anyone arrived, there was nothing to be done. Maggie was watering the terrace plants when the phone rang. She stood still for a moment with the watering can in her hand. The moment had the quality of something that will be remembered with specificity for the rest of her life, the exact slant of the afternoon light. The sound of a bus on the street below the particular green of the pothos against the terrace railing. Then she set the watering can down on the terrace floor with great care, as though it were made of something fragile, and went inside and sat down in the living room armchair. She sat there until Harlan arrived at 7 that evening. The wake was on a Thursday at a funeral home on the Upper East Side. More people came than Maggie had expected, and fewer than Thomas deserved. Desmond Pruitt, Thomas's former supervisor at the Forest Service, arrived and stood for a long time in front of the casket without being able to say anything. Dr. Vera Whitfield from NYU, Thomas's research collaborator for the better part of 20 years, brought a bouquet of wildflowers that Maggie found the most appropriate gift imaginable. Two younger researchers Maggie did not recognize stood in the corner and spoke in the low, continuous voices of people who are paying their respects by continuing to think about the work, which is how certain people show devotion. Harlan and Clifton were there with their wives. Serena held her glass by the fingertips. Patricia checked her phone with the discretion of someone who believes discretion is measured in the angle of the screen rather than the fact of the checking. The grandchildren were home with babysitters. Maggie noted this. She noted it and placed it in the part of herself that keeps accurate records of things without requiring them to immediately mean anything. In the days that followed, both sons came with a frequency that Maggie, in the first muffled weeks of grief, misread as genuine feeling. Harlan came every day. Clifton called in the mornings and appeared in the afternoons. They brought food and managed logistics and handled what needed handling. And Maggie received their presence from the armchair in the living room. The same armchair she had sat in the afternoon of the phone call. The way a person at the center of a current receives the water moving around them. It was in the second week that she understood. Harlan sat down across from her with a manila envelope and arranged his face into an expression designed to read as gentle. "Mom," he said, "we need to talk about the documents." There was a will. Thomas had filed it with a notary in 2016, the same year as the morning on the stoop, which Maggie noticed, and which pressed on her chest in a way she could not immediately explain. The structure was straightforward, the Upper West Side apartment, and the investment accounts totaling approximately $170,000 after market adjustments to be divided equally between the two sons. For Maggie, a parcel of native woodland in Augusta County, Virginia, deed number 47,222 in the county land registry, totaling 30 acres. Harlan set the envelope on the coffee table between them and looked at his mother with the expression of someone delivering information they have already decided is unfortunate. "We looked it up," he said. "The land is a designated natural area. You can't build on it. You can't subdivide it. There's a trail in, but no road access. It's dense forest. Thomas left it to you." He confirmed this as though she might not have understood it the first time. Clifton, who had been standing at the window through the entire conversation with his phone held loosely at his side, looked up once. "Mom, the apartment will need to be transferred to our names. That's what the will says. We'll give you a few months to figure out arrangements." "A few months," Maggie repeated. "It's reasonable," Serena said from the kitchen doorway. Harlan glanced at his wife with the small controlled movement of an eyebrow that said, "I didn't need you to say that." But he said nothing. Maggie looked at the envelope on the coffee table. She looked at the bookshelf along the far wall. Thomas's books on the left side, dense and technical, some of them with pressed leaves between the pages, where he had marked passages with whatever was available when the thought struck him. She looked at the watercolor painting of Harper's Ferry, above the sofa which Thomas had bought from a local artist when they were still dating. Because it showed the town from the East Ridge and the light in the painting fell across the river. The way he said it fell in real life in late November. She rubbed her thumb against her wedding band. She did not ask why the tools in the basement storage unit were worth keeping, but the mother was not. The answer would not have changed anything, and Maggie was a woman who had long ago learned not to ask questions whose answers would not change anything. What followed in the 3 months after that conversation was not something Maggie described in detail to anyone. There are experiences that resist narration, not because they are too large for language, but because the language exists. It is simply that using it requires a kind of exposure that serves no one. But fragments emerged at different times and to different people that together assembled a portrait adequate enough to understand. There was the morning she woke at 3 and heard footsteps in the apartment, and took a full second to remember that no one could be walking in the apartment. And the second of forgetting was followed by a pain she described once to no one in particular, as falling from a height she had not climbed. There was the afternoon Serena arrived with an interior designer, and the two of them moved through the apartment with a measuring tape that snapped at the ends, calling numbers aloud. This wall is 14 feet, the terrace is 10 feet deep. This floor will need to come up. Maggie stood in the kitchen holding a coffee cup she had not yet filled. There was the last Saturday she went to the Columbus Avenue Farmers Market, and the daughter of old Mr. Bellamy from the fruit stand spotted her across the produce tables and came over and held her hand for a moment before letting go. It was a small gesture, completely ordinary, utterly unnecessary. Maggie made it half a block before she had to stop and wait for her breathing to level. There was the night Harlan called to confirm the move-out date and said, as though conferring a favor, "We set aside Dad's things for you to take. The rest stays because we'll be using it." Maggie asked what counted as Thomas's things. Harlan said the books she wanted, the photographs, the clothing. They would need to keep the tools. She did not ask why. And there was a rainy night in August when the rain was tapping against the bedroom window in the small, steady way that Maggie associated with insomnia. And she opened the drawer of Thomas's nightstand, which Harlan and Clifton had not touched, presumably because nothing in it appeared to have financial value, and found 3 things. A photograph of herself young and laughing on a beach she did not recognize, looking at someone outside the frame of the image. A slip of paper in Thomas's small, precise handwriting. 5 words, "You will never be alone." And a smaller envelope tucked beneath the photograph with a note written on the outside in the same hand. "Open it only when you're there." Maggie held the envelope for a long time. Long enough that the rain outside shifted register, coming harder for a while and then easing. Long enough that the apartment settled around her, the way old buildings settle at night. The particular sounds of a structure that has been lived in for many years. Then she put the envelope back under the photograph. She closed the drawer. She did not open it. She was not ready to open it. And she was not ready to ask herself why she was not ready, because the answer to that question was something she already knew and did not yet need to look at directly. She knew there was something in that envelope that would change the shape of what came next. She could feel the gravity of it, the way you feel the gravity of a door you are not ready to walk through. Not with fear exactly, with the specific weight of a moment that cannot be taken back once it arrives. She left it where Thomas had placed it. The morning of the move was a Thursday in early September, 3 months and 4 days after the conversation with Harlan and the manila envelope. Maggie had the blue suitcase and 2 cardboard boxes, the books she had chosen, the photographs, the burgundy wedding album, her mother's floral tablecloth, the Harper's Ferry watercolor, the things that were hers in ways that had nothing to do with what the will specified. She left the terrace plants. Harlan was there when she left, standing in the doorway with the posture of a man who has prepared himself emotionally for a situation and is executing the preparation correctly. He hugged his mother at the door. The hug lasted exactly the right amount of time, not so brief as to seem indifferent, not so extended as to feel genuinely felt. "If you need anything, Mom," he said. Maggie did not respond because there was no adequate response to that sentence in that moment. She took the elevator down alone. 2 trips for the boxes. The doorman was out sick and there was no one to help. She stacked everything on the sidewalk and waited for the cab. The September sky above Manhattan was white and direct. She looked up at the 8th floor one last time. The terrace plants were still there. The Harper's Ferry watercolor was not. She had taken it. She looked at the plants for a moment. Then she looked at the street. The cab arrived after 4 minutes, and the driver, without being asked, got out and helped her lift the suitcase into the trunk. And she said thank you, in a clear, steady voice, because a clear, steady voice was what she had. And some days that is the whole of what you can offer. And it is enough. She did not look up again. She had $530 in her checking account, a pension from the Forest Service that would begin processing in the coming weeks, and 30 acres of dense woodland in the Virginia mountains that her sons had signed over to her because they had looked it up on a map and decided it was not worth the trouble of wanting. She had a blue suitcase. She had 2 cardboard boxes. She had an envelope she had not opened, tucked into the outer pocket of the backpack she carried in her lap, with 5 words on the outside in Thomas's handwriting that she had memorized without intending to. "Open it only when you are there." The cab moved into traffic and the building disappeared behind them. And Maggie Holt sat very still in the back seat with her hands in her lap, and the city moving past the windows the way cities do when you are leaving them all at once familiar and already becoming the past. She was going to Virginia. She did not know yet what she would find there. But she knew, in the way that a person knows things they cannot yet fully articulate, that Thomas had been building towards something for a very long time, and that whatever it was, it had been built for her. She spent 6 days in Staunton before she was ready to go in. The hotel was called the 24 South. A clean, modest place 100 yards from the historic district, with a view of the old courthouse from the window of her room, and a breakfast included in the rate that she ate alone each morning at a corner table, drinking coffee she did not taste and watching the courthouse through the glass while the town came slowly to life around her. She needed someone who knew the way. That was the practical reason for the 6 days. The trail was not marked on any public map. There was no address. There was a deed number and a county registry entry and 30 acres of designated natural area somewhere in the Allegheny foothills west of town, and without someone who had been there before, she would be walking into forest with no fixed point of entry and no reliable sense of what she was looking for. But the 6 days were not only about logistics, and she knew it. She was not ready. And she had lived long enough to know the difference between the delay that comes from fear and the delay that comes from a kind of deep preparation, the kind the body undertakes on its own when it understands that what is coming will require everything available. She had felt it once before. The morning Harlan was born, sitting in the hospital corridor at 4 in the morning, knowing the next hours would change the shape of her life permanently, and feeling, beneath the nervousness, a fundamental steadiness, a gathering. She felt it now. On the 3rd day, she called Desmond Pruitt. She had found his number in the small address book Thomas kept in the inner pocket of the jacket she had taken from his closet the night before the move. A brown canvas field jacket he had owned for 20 years, worn soft at the elbows, that smelled still faintly of pine resin, and the particular kind of cold that exists only in Virginia mountains in autumn. She had not meant to take the jacket. She had reached for it without deciding to. Desmond answered on the second ring. He was 62 years old now, retired from the Forest Service after 34 years living outside of Staunton in a house on property he had been slowly reforesting since the 90s. His voice on the phone was the voice of a man who spent his life outdoors unhurried, direct without the kind of verbal cushioning that people who work primarily indoors tend to accumulate. "Miss Maggie," he said, and she could hear in those two words that he had been expecting this call or something like it. "I know where it is. I went there with him once. Let me arrange a day and I'll take you." They met on a Thursday morning in front of the Staunton courthouse at 7:30. The sun still low and the fog coming down off the Blue Ridge in slow heavy bands. The kind of fog that does not burn off quickly, but settles into the hollows and stays for hours, giving the morning a muffled quality, as though the world were holding something in reserve. Desmond drove a truck that smelled of diesel and dried mud, and had a crack in the windshield on the passenger side that had been there long enough to acquire its own character. He wore canvas work trousers and a flannel shirt, and looked, Maggie thought, like a man who had never in his life worn anything designed for an occasion. On the drive out of town, heading west on the state highway, with the mountains rising on either side and the fog lying in the valleys between them, Desmond talked with the economy of someone who knows the difference between the words that are necessary and the words that are not. He said Thomas Holt was the finest species cataloger he had encountered in 3 decades of Forest Service work. Not the fastest, not the most published. The finest, which is a different category entirely, and one that the institutional mechanisms of scientific work are not particularly good at measuring or rewarding. He said that in the later years of Thomas's career, when his consulting work took him repeatedly into the Virginia and West Virginia highlands, he would sometimes drop from contact for a day or two during a field trip and reappear with photographs and soil samples and ecological observations that Desmond could never quite trace back to any survey location on the official documentation. He had assumed it was Thomas being Thomas thorough in ways that exceeded what the assignment required, attentive to things adjacent to the immediate task, because he could not help but be attentive to them. He understood it differently now. "The last time I went out there with him," Desmond said, keeping his eyes on the road, "maybe 2 years before he passed, I noticed something. Couldn't name it then. Can name it now." He paused. He had the look of a man who sees something he's worked on for a very long time and thinks it's ready. Maggie watched the fog move through the trees on the hillside above the road. "Ready for what?" she said. Desmond was quiet for a moment. "I don't know exactly. Just ready, like a thing that's reached the point it was always moving toward." They left the state highway on a gravel road that branched off without signage, marked only by an old wooden post with no text on it. Nothing that would mean anything to someone who did not already know. Desmond parked the truck in a wide spot where the gravel ended and the ground became forest floor, and they got out into the cool fog-damp air of the Virginia morning. Maggie carried a small backpack, water, a turkey sandwich she had made in the hotel room that morning, and in the outer pocket in the place where it had lived since the night she found it in Thomas's nightstand drawer, the envelope. "Open it only when you're there." Desmond stepped down from the truck and extended his hand to help her. She got down without taking it, but she met his eye when she did, and he nodded once in a way that indicated he understood the distinction. The trail entered the forest immediately. Within 10 steps, the road was gone behind them. Within 20 steps, the sound of the truck, the distant hum of the state highway, the ordinary acoustic texture of the world outside, all of it gone. What remained was the forest. Maggie had spent enough time in the mountains over the years to know that forests have registers the way music has registers, and that the register of old growth is different from the register of secondary forest or managed woodland. There is a quality of depth to it, a layering of sound and silence and biological density that newer growth has not yet achieved, and perhaps cannot achieve within a single human lifetime. You feel it more than you hear it, a kind of atmospheric weight, the sense of being inside something that has been in the process of becoming for a very long time. She walked behind Desmond and did not speak. The ground changed beneath her feet as they moved deeper in. Dirt to leaves, leaves to roots, roots to the soft layered duff of a forest floor that absorbs each footfall without sound, as though the ground itself is making a deliberate choice about noise. There were ferns everywhere, enormous and irregular, carpeting the ground in patterns that looked both random and considered. Wild orchids growing directly on the trunks of trees, their roots finding purchase in the bark, the way certain things find purchase in unlikely surfaces, not despite the difficulty, but in a kind of collaboration with it. Birds she could not name moving through the canopy above in the particular way of birds that know they are not being watched. The smell. Pine resin and wet earth, and something underneath both of those, something green and generative and very old. The smell of a place that has been left alone long enough to become fully itself. She walked with the ache in her right knee she had carried since her mid-60s and did not think about it. 17 minutes into the trail, Desmond stopped. He turned and looked at her over his shoulder. His expression was the expression of a man who has seen what is around the next bend and understands that what is about to happen is not his to manage. "Are you ready?" he said. Maggie looked ahead. The trail curved between two oak trees that had grown alongside each other for so long that their upper branches had grown into each other, forming a canopy overhead that was functionally a single structure. Two separate trees that had become something joined. Beyond the curve, she could not yet see. She rubbed her thumb against her wedding band. "Yes," she said. They came around the curve. What Maggie saw first was more forest, and she was still registering that still in the mode of trail and undergrowth and dappled canopy light, when the scale of something changed in her peripheral vision, and she looked left and understood. The house had been built to belong to the forest rather than to interrupt it. That was the first thing, and it was a thing Thomas had achieved with a specificity of intention that she would come to understand better over the weeks and months that followed. The old fig trees along the eastern face with roots that traced the foundation line without breaching it. The oaks providing a canopy above the roof line that fractured the light into moving patterns across the walls throughout the day. Wild bromeliads settled in the angles where the roof met the siding, as though they had chosen their locations with care. The house was L-shaped. 1,900 square feet of black walnut, she would learn later, that Thomas had cut and dried the timber himself from the reforestation groves he had cultivated on the property over the years, using carpentry joints in many places that required no hardware wood fitted to wood, with the precision that comes from long practice and genuine patience. The roof had a deep pitch and colonial tile in a dark charcoal that shed rain cleanly from the walls. In one corner, two solar panels on a hand-welded iron mount painted green. The windows were wood-framed with interior shutters. Beneath each sill, a planting box where ferns had taken hold and grown in green cascades that no one had arranged. The entrance door was solid black walnut, with cast-iron hinges and a latch that matched and carved into the upper panel, visible only up close, a pattern of oak leaves that Thomas had cut by hand. Maggie stood before the door for a long time. Desmond stood 3 steps back and slightly to the side, present but unobtrusive in the way of someone who has learned that the most respectful thing you can do at certain moments is take up as little room as possible. The latch yielded to the pressure of her hand. The door opened with the sound of well-fitted wood, a clean resistance, and then a giving way that was complete and without complaint. A door built to function for many decades and maintained in the condition of functioning. The smell that came out was dry wood and linseed oil, and underneath both of those forest air that had been moving through the ventilation gaps, earth and resin, and the particular breath of old growth coming through the walls, the way Thomas had designed them to breathe, so that the interior was not a refuge from the forest outside, but a continuation of it. The main room was 20 feet by 26, with 11-foot ceilings that made the space feel larger than its measurements. The walls were vertical plank black walnut, the same material as the exterior, and the floor was yellow cedar, laid in herringbone, smooth from what would turn out to be 30 years of Earl Grady's weekly maintenance, worn to a matte finish that had the quality of something earned rather than manufactured. Along the northern wall, 3 large windows let in the filtered diffuse light of a forest mid-morning. Before the windows, a long table in rough-hewn walnut with 4 chairs, whose leather seats had dried slightly but remained intact. On the opposite wall, floor to ceiling, built into the structure of the wall itself, so that it was not furniture but architecture, the bookshelf. 3,000 volumes organized in the order she recognized immediately as Thomas's order. By subject. Within the subject, by author. Within the author, by publication date. Silviculture, forest ecology, environmental law, natural history of the American woodland. Technical volumes with worn spines interspersed with novels and poetry books. She knew thorough Mary Oliver, a copy of The Old Man and the Sea, whose spine was so broken it had clearly been read to the point of structural failure. Which meant it had been read the way Thomas read things he loved, which was many times and without mercy for the binding. And in the left corner of the shelf, at exactly her eye level, a row of photo albums. 11 of them bound in brown leather, numbered in pencil on the spine. She took number 1 off the shelf. The first photographs were of bare land, a space cleared of undergrowth, a circular opening in the canopy where direct sunlight fell to the ground. The date printed beneath the first image was March 1995. Maggie looked at the year for a moment. 1995. Harlan had been 20 years old, Clifton 17. She and Thomas had been married for 22 years. He had been building this for 25 years. She put the album back carefully and continued into the space. The kitchen opened directly off the main room, with no wall between them. Just a change in the floor from wood plank to handmade terracotta tile in a warm ochre that Thomas must have carried to the site in pieces over multiple trips. Stone countertops rough-surfaced, wooden wall cabinets with louvered doors, a simple sink connected to the rainwater collection system, a gas range with a tank beneath the counter. A cream-colored refrigerator of the type manufactured before they all became identical, connected to the solar array currently off. The pantry shelves held glass jars of rice-dried beans, coffee oil, salt, sugar, and a row of home-preserved goods in mason jars with handwritten paper labels identifying the contents and date. The most recent label said, "Pickled Ramps, July 2019." 16 months before Thomas died. He had been standing in this kitchen, in this forest, filling mason jars and writing labels in his small, precise hand, 16 months before his heart stopped on a dirt road outside of Staunton. Desmond had followed her inside and was moving through the space quietly, with the care of someone who understands they are in a room that belongs to another person's grief. He stopped in front of the preserved jars and looked at them for a moment without speaking. Then he said, almost to himself, "He knew you were coming." Maggie did not answer. She rubbed her thumb against her wedding band. The hallway of the kitchen led to 2 bedrooms. The smaller was a simple guest room. single-bed wool blanket in a deep blue, a window, a bookshelf with a modest and deliberate selection of volumes. The larger bedroom was at the end of the hall. When she opened the door and walked in, she stood in the center of the room for a long time without moving. The bed was a double made up with a white sheet pulled tight and flat with the precision of someone who had made it recently and with purpose. There were two pillows, two nightstands identical. The one on the left, Thomas's side, the left side in every hotel room and rental cabin, and borrowed bed they had shared over 47 years held a lamp. The one on the right held a lamp and a photograph in a simple wooden frame. Maggie walked to the right side of the bed and looked at the photograph. It was the same image that had been in Thomas's nightstand drawer in the Manhattan apartment. Her young, laughing on a beach she did not yet recognize, looking towards someone outside the frame. The same photograph, but larger, and framed, and placed here on the right nightstand on her side of a bed, in a house in the middle of a forest that no one in her family had known existed. He had put it on her side. He had built this house room by room over 25 years, and he had put her photograph on her side of the bed. And then he had had Earl Grady come every week to keep it ready, and he had waited. She was still looking at the photograph when she heard the sound of footsteps outside, measured, unhurried footsteps on the packed earth of the path. The footsteps of someone who knew the terrain and moved through it at their own pace without performing the knowing. Desmond went to the living room window, then to the front door and opened it. The man on the other side was 63 years old with a straw hat and canvas work trousers and rubber boots to the knee and the hand-planed quality to his face that comes from decades of weather and outdoor work. He was carrying a bucket in each hand, one with tools, one with fruit, from what would turn out to be an orchard Thomas had planted in the clearing south of the house. He stopped when he saw Desmond. Then he looked past Desmond and found Maggie standing in the living room. "Are you Miss Maggie?" he said. "I'm Maggie," she said. He set both buckets down on the ground and removed his hat. The gesture was genuine and unhurried. The gesture of a man raised in a time when you removed your hat for certain people and who had kept the habit because he believed in what it meant. "My name is Earl Grady," he said. "I worked with your husband for 30 years. He asked me to tell you he'd been waiting a long time for this." Earl Grady was a Virginia man born and raised in these particular mountains, the son of a timber worker and a woman who had kept a kitchen garden and known the names of every plant in it in both English and the older vocabulary her own grandmother had used. His knowledge of the native species of the Allegheny Highlands was not the knowledge that comes from study, though he had done some of that too. It was the knowledge that comes from a lifetime of being present in a specific place, in all its seasons and weathers and biological moods. He knew which vine bloomed in August. He knew which native orchid grew only above a certain elevation, with a certain moisture profile. He knew from the particular quality of a bird's call in the early morning, when rain was coming before any instrument could confirm it. Thomas had found him in 1992 on a Forest Service survey expedition, where Earl had served as a local guide. Thomas had been impressed not just by his knowledge, but by something harder to name, a quality of restraint and respect that manifested in specific behaviors. Earl never collected what should not be collected. He never left fire. He never cut what did not need cutting. Thomas had written in a field report afterward in language uncharacteristic of official documentation. "This man genuinely respects the forest." They had worked together for 30 years. Earl had carried timber and mixed concrete and laid tile and helped Thomas raise the roof one weekend in May of 2002, just the two of them. A long, hard day that ended with a bottle of bourbon Earl brought from his house, and the particular satisfaction of men who have completed something physical and demanding and done it well. Thomas had paid Earl fairly for everything. Meticulously, Earl confirmed. And beyond the payment, he had given Earl something that Earl said without sentimentality. He valued more the complete trust of a man who meant what he said. He asked one thing of me beyond the work. Earl told them seated at the walnut table in the living room, while Maggie and Desmond sat across from him. He asked me to keep the house ready, as if someone might arrive at any moment who needed to live in it. I came here every week for 30 years. He left a maintenance fund with his attorney enough to cover expenses for 20 years after his death. Maggie looked at him steadily. He planned this 20 years before he died. He planned it from the beginning, Earl said. The first time he told me what he was doing out here, that he was building a place where you could live after he was gone, where you'd be taken care of in ways that didn't depend on anyone else's willingness to provide. He was about 50 years old, maybe just under. He paused. He said he could see what the family was going to do when the time came. He said the boys were going to take the concrete and that the concrete was the least of what he had, that what he truly had was here. The room was quiet for a moment. The forest outside continued its ordinary business. The movement of wind through the upper canopy. A bird somewhere in the middle distance, the subtle acoustic texture of a living system doing what living systems do. Maggie held what Earl had said in the way you hold things that need time before they can be fully processed. Thomas at 50, already calculating what his sons would do, already working backward from that understanding to build something they could not reach and she could not lose. 23 more years of weekends in the mountains of sawdust on his trousers of rolls of film, developed in sealed envelopes of blueprints closed before the wrong eyes could read them. 23 years of building toward one specific day, the day she would come here alone and find what he had left for her. She did not know exactly how to feel about this. It was not surprise. It was something more like recognition. The confirmation of something she had sensed for years without being able to form into a complete thought. That Thomas saw her not just in the present tense, but across time. That his love was not only the daily love of a long marriage, but something with a longer horizon. Something that took into account futures she had not yet arrived at. Earl left after an hour, setting the fruit bucket on the kitchen counter and the tool bucket near the door, and writing his phone number on a piece of paper he placed in the kitchen drawer beneath the mason jars. Before he left, he stood in the doorway for a moment with his hat in his hands. "Your husband talked about you every time he came here," he said. "Sometimes we'd work for hours without stopping, laying floor, repointing the stonework, whatever needed doing, and he'd talk. He'd tell stories from when you were first in the city, from when the boys were young, from things you'd said that stayed with him." He looked at Maggie directly. "He talked about how you listened to him when he talked about this work, how most people pretended interest and you actually wanted to understand." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was quieter, but very steady. "I have never heard a man talk about a woman the way he talked about you. Like the most important thing he had done in his life was simply being at your side." Maggie held this. Desmond went outside to check the solar panels and the rainwater collection system, giving her the space she needed without making a decision about it. She was alone in the living room. She took off the backpack and set it on the table, opened the outer pocket, took out the envelope. It was the same envelope. It had always been small cream-colored with her name in Thomas's handwriting on the front and the 5 words below it that she had been carrying for months without opening. She sat down at the table. She unfolded the flap carefully without tearing it because she intended to keep it. Inside were many pages, more than she had expected. covered in Thomas's small blue ink handwriting, slightly slanted in places, as though written on a surface that was not entirely level. At the top of the first page, no date, no formal greeting, just Maggie. She began to read. He had found the clearing by accident. March of 1995. A flat tire on the state highway and a trail entering the forest from the road shoulder that did not appear on any of his maps. He had followed it. He could not follow it. She knew this about him, this incapacity to leave an unexplored path unexplored. And 20 minutes in, he had found the clearing, and he had felt something he had never felt before, and did not have a word for the sensation of a place that had been waiting for him. He had bought the land in November of that year. 30 acres of designated natural area priced low because no one could build on it or subdivide it. Cash from savings he had accumulated over years without knowing why he was accumulating it. He had not told her because at the time he did not yet know what he was going to do. And by the time he understood what he was going to do, he had understood also that telling her would mean telling her sons, and telling her sons would mean that when the time came, there would be a dispute. He knew Harlan. He knew how Harlan's intelligence operated, and he knew that an attorney with a financial incentive and a willing brother could complicate almost anything that was not already legally settled. So he had kept it simple on paper and kept the real value somewhere the paper could not reach. He had built for 25 years, learning carpentry out of necessity and becoming good at it out of the stubbornness she had always known was one of his defining qualities. The walls had taken 4 years, the roof 2, the kitchen 3, the study, the last room, finished in 2018. He wrote about the 12 native species he had catalogued on the property over those years. The yellow lady's sleeper orchid, 3 species of native bromeliad, 2 endemic orchids. The Appalachian running cedar, declared locally extinct in 1982, which Thomas had rediscovered on the property in 2006 and documented carefully but not published, because publishing would have drawn attention he was not ready to invite. These species made the land eligible for a federal conservation enhancement program. The annual payment $55,000 indexed to inflation. Dr. Vera Whitfield at NYU had seen the land. Her proposal for a field research station was in the blue folder in the study. $27,000 per year, 10-year renewable contract, the university assuming maintenance costs. Maggie free to continue living on the property without restriction. The carbon credits. 22 of the 30 acres had been reforested over 3 decades. White oaks, tulip poplars, American chestnuts, red maples planted at appropriate density for sustainable management. A Richmond-based firm called Appalachian Carbon Partners had done a preliminary valuation. The figure was in the folder, $1.1 million. And an environmental attorney in Richmond, Joanne Calloway, had been retained in 2018 to oversee the entire process. The documentation was complete. The applications were pre-filed. All that was needed was for Maggie to arrive with the deed and the death certificate, and the process would begin with an estimated timeline of 90 days to approval. He had pre-filed everything. There was an attorney waiting for her. Maggie stopped reading for a moment and looked at the north window. The late morning light was coming through the trees in the particular way it did at this hour, shifting slightly with the movement of the canopy above, never quite direct, always filtered through something green and living. The orchid Thomas had mentioned in the postscript was there on the sill. Small, settled, composed in the way of things that have been where they are for a long time. She read the last section of the letter. He wrote that he had something to say and was going to say it plainly, because he was better with wood than with words. And she had always known this, and he hoped she would extend him the same patience she had extended him in everything else. He wrote that he had married her in March of 1973 and that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and that he was not saying this the way people say it in letters with the inflation of sentiment that letters tend toward, but in the way a person says something after 47 years of reviewing the same evidence and checking the calculation again, and the calculation always resolves to the same answer. He wrote that the windows faced east because she had always loved mornings, that the bed was made up on the right side because the right side had always been hers, that the bookshelf held the books she would want, including some he had identified over the last 2 years, that he knew she had not yet read ordered specifically for this room, that the garden had the herbs she used, that the orchard had the fruit she loved, including pawpaw, because she had said once years ago that it was the most beautiful fruit that existed, and it was a crime that no one planted it anymore. And he had thought about that for a long time and eventually decided she was correct. He wrote, "You were never forgotten. You were never left behind. You were protected. They kept the concrete. You kept the forest. And the forest was always worth more." And then in his small, careful hand at the bottom of the last page, "With all the love a whole life can hold, Thomas. P.S. The orchid at the north window needs water once a week. Not much, it doesn't like direct sun. You'll know how to take care of it. You've always known how to take care of everything." Maggie read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully along the original creases and placed it back in the envelope and held the envelope in both hands on the table in front of her. She cried, not the way she had cried the afternoon of the phone call, which had been a grief without shape, vast and disorienting, and without any organizing principle. This was different in quality entirely. This was the crying that happens when something that has hurt for a long time finally makes sense. When the story that appeared to have ended badly reveals the paragraph that was missing. When you understand all at once and completely that you were never as alone as you believed yourself to be. Desmond came back inside after a while and stopped in the doorway when he saw her. He did not speak. He went and sat in the farthest chair from the table and looked at his hands and gave her the space she needed, with the quiet dignity of a person who has learned over a long life that the most useful thing you can sometimes do for another human being is simply be present without requiring them to perform being all right. When the crying had moved through its necessary arc and settled into something lower and more breathable, Maggie looked up. "He knew everything," she said. "Thomas always knew everything," Desmond said. That was Thomas. Maggie looked at the north window. The orchid was there in the morning light, small and composed on the sill. The buds were already formed small dents, certain of what they were about to do. It was not yet October, but it was close. For the first 15 days, Maggie made no decisions. This was itself a decision, though she did not frame it that way at the time. She woke when she woke. She made coffee from rainwater heated on Thomas's gas range ground, fresh each morning in a hand grinder she found in the back of a kitchen cabinet. A gift she recognized as deliberate because Thomas had known she preferred fresh ground and had never owned a hand grinder in the Manhattan apartment, which meant he had bought this one for her for mornings he would not be present for. She took the coffee to the front porch and stood for a while looking at the oaks, and then she went inside and read. For the first time in 50 years, there was nothing she needed to do for another person before she could attend to herself. The recognition of this arrived not as relief but as something stranger and more disorienting. A kind of spaciousness she did not immediately know how to inhabit. The days in the Manhattan apartment had been organized around maintenance, the apartment itself. Thomas's schedule, the boys when they were young, and then the habits that had calcified around those original obligations. long after the obligations themselves had changed shape. Tuesday quilting, Thursday library, Saturday market. The rhythm of a life built around being available, which is a good life and an honorable one, but which does not prepare you well for mornings when there is simply nothing required. She read Thomas's books. She started with the natural history volumes because they were the ones that told her most directly about the place she was in, the species around her, the geological history of these particular mountains, the long story of the Appalachian Highland ecosystem and what had been done to it and what was slowly imperfectly being returned. The language was technical in places, and she worked through it without apology. The way she had always worked through things she did not immediately understand, which was with patience and without the pretense that not understanding yet was the same as not being able to understand. She discovered reading in that room with the forest light changing across the cedar floor throughout the day, that she loved this material in a way she had not anticipated. She had respected Thomas's work for decades. She had listened to him talk about it with genuine interest for 47 years. But there is a difference between understanding something through another person's relationship to it and coming to it directly. And what she felt reading those books in that room was the particular pleasure of direct encounter, the world outside the window being named and explained and contextualized in ways that made it simultaneously more legible and more astonishing. On the fourth day, Ruth Grady arrived. She came in the late morning with a covered pot that she carried in both hands and sat on the kitchen counter without ceremony or announcement, lifting the lid to let the steam out and saying, "Black bean and smoked pork, the way my grandmother made it and her grandmother before that." She was a compact woman in her early 60s with strong forearms and a direct way of speaking that contained no unnecessary softening. She said what she meant and expected the same in return. And the expectation was not unkind but simply efficient. Maggie recognized the manner immediately. It was her mother's manner. It was her grandmother Eleanor's manner. It was the manner of women who had done hard work their entire lives and had no energy left for the kind of social lubrication that makes hard things slightly harder by requiring you to pretend they are not hard. Something in Maggie loosened that had not loosened since she had left New York. They ate together at the kitchen table, and Ruth talked about the property the way someone talks about a place they have watched carefully for a long time, not with ownership, but with a specific and detailed affection. She knew which section of the orchard fruited earliest in the summer. She knew where the deer came through in late autumn, and which plants they left alone. She knew the history of the clearing south of the house, which Thomas and Earl had opened up over several years in the late 90s to allow enough light for the orchard to establish itself. "Are you staying?" Ruth asked at a point in the meal where the question felt natural rather than presumptuous. "I'm staying," Maggie said. Ruth nodded, once the nod of a person who has received information that confirms what they already believed. "Good," she said. "This house has been waiting for you far too long." On the 20th day, Maggie opened the blue folder. She sat at the walnut table with the folder in front of her and went through it, document by document, taking her time, reading each one fully before moving to the next. The 12 species assessments, each with photographs and GPS coordinates and federal listing status, and the careful, detailed observation records that were unmistakably Thomas's, precise and thorough, and occasionally in the marginal notes, lit from within by something that was not quite poetry but was adjacent to it. Observe third blooming of yellow lady slipper in Sector 4, unchanged from 2011. Some things persist by being left alone. The topographic survey of the full 30 acres done in 2018 with full contour mapping. Dr. Vera Whitfield's proposal from NYU, 5 pages with the institutional letterhead and Whitfield's signature at the bottom, proposing the research station arrangement in the terms Thomas had described in his letter. $27,000 annually, 10-year renewable contract. University responsible for infrastructure. Maggie free to continue living on the property without any restriction or interference. The preliminary carbon assessment from Appalachian Carbon Partners, 12 pages of methodology and projected timelines and market analysis. And on the final page, the valuation figure that Thomas had cited in his letter. $1.1 million in carbon credits negotiable on the voluntary market over a 30-year sustainable management period. And at the bottom of the folder, a formal correspondence envelope from a law office in Richmond. Joanne Calloway, attorney at law, environmental and conservation practice. Maggie opened it. A cover letter on legal stationery dated October 2018 confirming that the documentation for both the Federal Conservation Program application and the carbon credit certification process was complete and pre-filed, and that upon presentation of the property deed and the death certificate of Thomas Albright Holt, the attorney's office would initiate both processes with an estimated approval timeline of 90 days. Thomas had done everything. He had found the attorney and briefed her and prepared the documentation and pre-filed the applications. And then he had waited, and whatever he had thought about in the years between 2018 and his death in November of 2020. Whatever he had felt in the field on those final surveys in the Virginia Highlands, he had done it knowing that this folder existed and that eventually Maggie would sit at this table and open it and find everything she needed already in order. She sat with the letter for a long time. Then she picked up her phone. There was signal at the study window. She had discovered this on the third day. A single bar that held steady enough for calls if you stood in the right spot. She dialed the number printed on Joanne Calloway's letterhead. The attorney answered on the second ring. When Maggie said her name, there was a pause on the other end. Brief but distinct, the pause of someone shifting from the general readiness of professional availability to the specific readiness of a moment they have been expecting. Miss Maggie, Joanne Calloway said, "Your husband told me you would call. I've been waiting. When can you come to Richmond?" The weeks that followed moved with the particular momentum of things that have been prepared for over a long time and are now simply unfolding. The Federal Conservation Program application was formally filed on the 23rd of October. The university contract review began the first week of November, following a site visit from Dr. Whitfield and 2 members of the NYU Ecology Department, who spent a full day walking the property with Earl and returned in the late afternoon, with the expressions of people who have found exactly what they were looking for and are trying to maintain professional composure about it. Before leaving, Whitfield stood on the front porch with her jacket zipped against the late autumn air and said, "Miss Maggie, I want you to know something. This is the most intact research site I have visited anywhere in the Appalachian region. The combination of old-growth preservation and documented reforestation over 30 years, there is nothing else like it in the accessible literature." She paused. "Your husband was an extraordinary scientist and a remarkably disciplined one. He sat on the running cedar rediscovery for 17 years to protect this property. Most researchers couldn't have done that. He was disciplined about the things that mattered to him," Maggie said. Whitfield looked at her for a moment. "Yes, I believe he was." The university contract was signed in January. 2 doctoral researchers began their residency in February, one named Philip. 28 years old, with the seriousness of someone who has decided what his life is going to be about and is not ambivalent about it. And one named Isabel, 26, who knew the scientific name of every orchid on the property from memory, and who had, in her first week of fieldwork, located in the northeastern section of the property, a specimen of the Appalachian running cedar in active bloom, the species Thomas had rediscovered in 2006 and protected by silence for 17 years. Isabel's reaction to the discovery had been the reaction of someone who spends their professional life hoping to encounter exactly this kind of thing and is wholly unprepared for the reality of it when it arrives. She had stood in the forest for several minutes without speaking, looking at the plant with an attention that was close to reverence. Earl had watched from 30 feet away with the expression Maggie was coming to recognize as his specific variety of satisfaction. The quiet, undemonstrative pleasure of a man who has watched a thing develop over many years and is now watching it arrive at the purpose it was always moving toward. The conservation program approval came through in late January, 91 days after the application was filed, within the estimate Joanne Calloway had given. The first payment of $55,000 arrived in Maggie's account on the 28th of February. She was standing in the kitchen making coffee when the notification came through on her phone. She stood with the kettle in her hand for a long moment, looking at the number on the screen, and then she set the kettle down carefully on the stone counter and stood very still. Outside the kitchen window, the winter trees were doing what winter trees do in the Virginia mountains, standing bare and unhurried in the pale morning light, entirely indifferent to the season's difficulty. Waiting with the patience of things that have survived many winters and expect to survive many more. She poured the coffee. She went to the porch. She sat in the walnut rocking chair that she had found stored in the guest room during her second week and moved to the right corner of the porch, where the morning sun arrived first. A chair Thomas had made himself at some point during the long construction and stored inside against the weather, as though he had known there would need to be a place to sit and think on mornings exactly like this one. She sat with the mug in both hands and looked at the oaks and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. Not triumph, not vindication, something quieter and more permanent than either of those, the specific peace that comes when the ground beneath you has been proven solid. It was in April that Dr. Whitfield made the request. She had been cataloging the orchid specimens in the northeastern sector with Isabel when she identified something that the initial survey had flagged but not fully resolved, a specimen with morphological characteristics that did not align cleanly with any documented species in the regional literature. She brought her notes and photographs to the table on the front porch one evening and laid them out and walked Maggie through them with the careful precision of someone who does not want to overstate a finding, but is also aware that she may be looking at something significant. The specimen appeared to be a previously undescribed species. The genetic confirmation would take several more months, but the morphological evidence was strong. When we publish, Whitfield said, we'll need to provide a species epithet, a scientific surname. She looked at Maggie across the table. We'd like to use Holt, with your permission. For both of you, Thomas discovered the habitat and maintained it, and you are its guardian. Epidendrum holtiorum, the Holt's epidendrum. Maggie looked at the photograph spread across the table. The small, intricate flower documented in close detail, the root structure, the host bark, the surrounding microhabitat that Thomas had protected for 30 years without telling anyone why. She rubbed her thumb against her wedding band. You can use it, she said. It was in the study on an afternoon in late April when Dr. Whitfield and the researchers had come for their monthly documentation session that the second letter appeared. Whitfield had asked to review the field notebooks, Thomas's 22 spiral-bound journals numbered and dated from 1995 to 2019, looking for unpublished observational data that might supplement the formal species assessments. Maggie had shown her into the study, the small room in the L-shaped wing with shelves on 3 walls, and the east-facing window that caught the first light of each morning and held it longer than any other window in the house. She had been in the study many times in the month she had been living here. But there was a drawer in the lower left section of Thomas's desk that had resisted not locked but stuck the wood, having swelled slightly over years of seasonal humidity change, requiring more than a simple pull to open. She had meant to attend to it. She had not yet gotten around to it. That afternoon, after Whitfield and the researchers had finished their review of the notebooks and departed down the trail in the long light of an April evening, Maggie stayed in the study. She found a flathead screwdriver in the tool bucket Earl kept near the front door and went back to the desk. The drawer opened with more resistance than expected, and then gave way all at once in the manner of stuck things when they finally release a lurch, a brief sound of wood against wood, and then the drawer fully open. Inside, a handful of pencils worn down to their last few inches, a folded topographic map of the property covered in Thomas's annotations, a spare battery for a field GPS still in its packaging, and beneath all of these, pushed to the back of the drawer as though placed there with intention, a small envelope smaller than the first, cream-colored, with a single word on the front written in blue ink. Maggie. She sat down at his desk. The late afternoon light was coming through the east window at a low horizontal angle, now the kind of light that makes everything it touches look like something worth preserving. She held the envelope for a moment before opening it, aware that this was the last one, that after this there would be no more letters, no more things left in drawers, no more prepared surprises waiting in the structure of a house built over 25 years by a man who had thought of everything. She opened it. One page, dated August 2019, 15 months before Thomas died. He wrote that he had found the drawer stuck that afternoon while reorganizing the study and had thought, this is the right place. She would need a screwdriver to open it, which meant it would take her some time to find her way in. But she was patient, and everything that mattered required some time, so it seemed appropriate. He wrote about the stream. She had found it in her second week on the property 200 yards behind the house, running over smooth pale stones in a shallow channel through a gap in the old-growth root system, making the sound that moving water makes over stone when there is nothing else competing with it. She had gone back to it many times since. She had sat on the flat rock at the bend and read and let her feet hang in the current on warm afternoons, and thought about nothing in particular, which is the most difficult kind of thinking and the most necessary. Thomas wrote that the stream was a natural mineral spring. He had had the water analyzed in 2018 by a geological laboratory in Charlottesville. The assessment was in the blue folder in the last section, which he might not have reached yet. The mineral composition was consistent with the springs that supplied the small batch bottling operations that had been establishing themselves across the Shenandoah Valley over the past decade. He had spoken informally with a businessman in the regional bottling sector, not to negotiate, not to commit to anything, simply to understand what was possible. The informal estimate was $12,000 to $16,000 annually in royalty payments for a small licensing arrangement. The contact information was in Joanne Calloway's files. Then he wrote, I don't know if you'll want to do this. You might prefer to leave the stream as a stream. That would also be the right decision. You'll know better than I do what it should be. And in the last paragraph in the same small, careful hand that she had been reading for 47 years and would spend the rest of her life missing, I couldn't stop planting. It's a disease. You always said so, and you were right. I leave you what I could, and perhaps more than was strictly necessary. But I find I cannot approach this with restraint. Take care of the orchid. T. Maggie read the letter twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and placed it with the first letter in the nightstand drawer on her side of the bed, where it would remain. She already knew what she would do about the stream. She had known really since an afternoon 3 weeks after her arrival, when she had sat on the flat rock at the bend, with her feet in the cold water, and Thomas's 2002 field notebook open in her lap, and had read the entry he had written on a day very much like that one. The stream this afternoon has the sound of a Saturday morning. I don't know how to describe it more precisely than that. Some things are worth more as they are than as whatever they could be converted into. This was perhaps the central understanding she had arrived at through all of it. That value is not always extractable, that some of it exists only in the form it takes, and that converting it into something else destroys the very thing that made it valuable in the first place. The stream would remain a stream. The call from Heartland came on a Tuesday evening in June, 3 months after the conservation payment arrived. Maggie was on the front porch with a mug of tea and Thomas's 2014 field notebook open in her lap. She had been reading the notebooks in order slowly, the way you read correspondence from someone you loved, and can no longer ask questions of attending to every word because none of them can be replaced. Harlan's name appeared on her phone screen. She watched it for 2 rings. Then she answered. His voice had the particular quality she had identified in him since he was 15. The voice he used when he wanted to appear reasonable while also wanting something. A careful voice. A managed voice. "Mom, we've been trying to reach you. How are you?" "I'm well," Maggie said. "I haven't had consistent signal." A brief pause. "You're on the land." "I am." Another pause, longer, the kind that indicates internal recalibration. "Mom, we found out some things about the property. It seems like there was more to it than we understood at the time. Clifton has a contact in the environmental consulting sector who mentioned the property name in the context of a conservation filing." Maggie looked at the oaks. The evening light was doing what it did at this hour in June, going amber and long. The trees casting shadows across the clearing that moved slowly as the sun descended. Everything taking on the quality of something that has earned the right to look the way it looks. "I see," she said. "Mom, if we had known the actual situation at the time of the estate division, the arrangement would have been different. We wouldn't have." "Harlan?" Her voice was not raised. It carried no heat and no bitterness and no particular drama. It was simply the voice of a woman who has decided what she is going to say and is saying it. "I'm going to say this once, so I'd like you to listen carefully." Silence on the other end. "Your father left exactly what he intended to leave to each person. You and Clifton received the apartment and the investment accounts. Those are legitimately yours, properly transferred under the will, and I have no intention of contesting them. I kept the land also legitimately mine, properly documented, signed over by both of you at the notary's office when you believed it had no value. Your father explained in his letter precisely why he structured things the way he did. If you want to understand his reasoning, the letter exists and I am willing to share it with you. But that is a separate conversation from the question of the property itself." She paused for a moment, and when she continued, her voice remained exactly as it had been, unhurried, without anger, carrying the particular weight of something that has grown slowly for a very long time. "If you want to maintain a relationship with me as my sons, the door is open. That is a conversation I am ready to have whenever you are ready to have it, honestly. If you want to pursue a legal challenge to the estate distribution, you will need attorneys other than yourselves. And you already know better than I do how courts tend to look at adult children contesting wills in order to reduce what their elderly mother received. You have handled enough estate cases to know exactly how those proceedings go. A long silence. Then Harlan said something she had not heard from him in a very long time, his voice stripped of the careful professional layer, quieter and less defended, and recognizably the voice of her son rather than of the attorney. Her son had become Mom. We were wrong. You were, she said. I don't know how to. You don't have to know how right now, Maggie said. That can wait until you're ready. What I'll say is this: come here when you want to. Both of you. Bring the children. Earl will show you the trail from the highway. It's 20 minutes on foot. She looked at the house behind her, at the carved oak leaves on the front door just visible in the fading light. Your father built something here that deserves to be seen by the people who carry his name. Whatever else is true, that part is still true. Harlan came in July alone without Serena. Canvas trousers and a collared shirt and shoes entirely wrong for the trail, which Maggie suspected was a form of honesty. He had not prepared himself to look as though he belonged here, and that was more truthful than if he had. Earl met him at the trailhead and brought him through the forest. When Harlan came around the curve between the two great oaks and saw the house for the first time, he stopped. He stood at the edge of the clearing without speaking. His face, for the first time in longer than Maggie could easily calculate, did not have the managed quality that decades of professional life had layered over it. He looked genuinely surprised, surprised in the way that breaks through whatever you have prepared yourself to feel and replaces it with something unmediated and real. My God, he said quietly. Come in, Maggie said. They spent 3 hours together. He walked through every room, slowly touching the walls with the flat of his hand. The way people touch things they are trying to understand through more senses than one. He stood in front of the bookshelf for a long time. He opened photo album number 1 and stood with it for nearly 10 minutes, turning the pages, slowly watching the house grow from a bare clearing in 1995 to what stood around him now. And his face while he turned those pages was the face of a man confronting something he does not have a category for. He did this for 25 years, Harlan said, without telling anyone. He told me, Maggie said, in the letter. Harlan looked at her. He set the album back on the shelf with care. Mom, I need to ask your forgiveness for a lot of things. I know, she said. Just asking isn't enough, he said. It isn't, she agreed. But it's a beginning, which is more than nothing. They sat on the porch with coffee as the afternoon light moved through the canopy in the long, slow way of summer afternoons in the Virginia mountains. And Harlan talked the way she had not heard him talk since he was a boy, without strategy, without the performance of reasonableness, without managing the outcome of the conversation at the same time as having it. He said he had spent his adult life treating her as a fixed feature of his world, someone permanently present who therefore required no particular attention. He said he had sorted his parents into categories. His father, the one with the visible life, his mother, the structure that held everything else in place, without ever asking himself whether the structure was not in fact the more essential thing. He said that sitting in a house built over 25 years by a man who had spent that entire time thinking about what his wife would need after he was gone, he felt the wrongness of that sorting, in a way he had not been able to feel when it was only abstract. Maggie listened. When he finished, she said, "You weren't cruel, you were careless. Carelessness can be corrected if a person decides to correct it." He mentioned the grandchildren, his boys 8 and 6 years old who were still her grandsons and who she barely knew. "I'd like to bring them," he said, "if you'll have them." Bring them, Maggie said. 20 minutes of trail is exactly what a child needs. He brought them 2 weeks later. Both boys arrived at the trailhead with the energy of children who have been told they are going into real forest and cannot quite process the information until they are actually inside it. And then they went very quiet in the way that children go quiet when something larger than their expectation arrives. The 8-year-old James spent the better part of 2 hours on his first afternoon standing completely still at the edge of the clearing, watching a garden spider construct her web in the angle between two oak trunks. He did not fidget. He did not speak. He watched with the whole of his attention the way children watch things before they learn that watching with the whole of your attention is something that requires explanation. Philip, the doctoral researcher, observed this from the porch steps and then went inside and came back with his own field guide to North American spiders annotated in the margins. With his own notes, a working copy, and wrote an inscription on the inside cover and gave it to the boy before leaving that evening. James read it through 3 times before the week was out, according to Heartland, who reported this with the slightly stunned expression of a father encountering something in his child he had not known was there. Clifton came in August with Patricia and their 2 children. The 12-year-old and the 9-year-old heard Earl mention the stream within the first 10 minutes of arriving and were gone toward it before anyone suggested they wait, which Earl watched with the quiet approval of a man who believes children should move toward water when water is available. Patricia stood in the center of the living room for a long time, looking at the bookshelf and the cedar floor and the northern window with its orchid on the sill, and did not speak. When she left in the late afternoon, she said thank you, 2 words, plain and direct. And the plainness of it told Maggie more than an elaborated statement would have. Clifton stopped at the edge of the clearing before they walked back to the trailhead and turned to look at the house one more time, the way you look at something you want to fix clearly in your memory. "Mom," he said, "I always knew you were stronger than we let you be." He looked at the house and the trees and the whole of what Thomas had made. "But this, he did a great deal for you, a very great deal." "Yes," Maggie said, "and I intend to be worthy of it." September came. A year had passed since the morning she had stood on the sidewalk outside 240 West 84th Street with 1 blue suitcase and 2 cardboard boxes and $530 and 30 acres of forest her sons had signed away because they looked it up on a map and decided it was not worth wanting. The property had been certified for the carbon credit program in August. The valuation revised upward by Appalachian Carbon Partners, following the completion of the full species documentation and the reforestation mapping, with the rare species confirmed, and the acreage precisely measured. The figure had increased from $1.1 to $1.35 million in negotiable credits. Joanne Calloway had communicated this in a letter that Maggie read at the kitchen table with her morning coffee and then sat down beside her cup and left there for the rest of the day, returning to it occasionally the way you return to something that requires more than one reading to fully receive. The stream she had decided about months ago. It would remain a stream. Not for any reason she could have argued in a document, not because the licensing arrangement was impractical, or the businessman Joanne had contacted was unreliable, because neither of those things was true, but because she had sat on the flat rock at the bend on a warm afternoon in June with her feet in the current and Thomas's 2002 notebook in her lap, and she had read the line he had written there, and she had understood something that she did not need anyone else to confirm. The stream this afternoon has the sound of a Saturday morning. I don't know how to describe it more precisely than that. Some things are worth more as they are. That was the whole of the reasoning, and it was sufficient. On a Tuesday morning in mid-September, Maggie was on the front porch with her coffee and the 2014 field notebook. When she turned to the October entry she had read many times now and knew nearly by heart. The orchid at the north window has bloomed again. It blooms every October, has done so for 20 years without fail. Such consistency, such faithfulness. There are things that require no justification beyond the fact of their continuing. She looked up from the page. The orchid at the north window was visible through the glass from where she sat. The new buds had formed over the past 2 weeks, small and dense, and entirely certain of what they were about to do. It was the third week of September. In a few days it would be October. And what had happened every October for 20 years would happen again, not because anyone had arranged it or maintained it or asked it to continue, but because it was the nature of the thing to continue, and the conditions here allowed it to do so. Maggie set the notebook in her lap and looked at the forest. The old oaks with their straight trunks and their wide circular canopies, which had taken 80 years to reach this size. She thought of the afternoon in 1971 when a young man had walked into a pharmacy in Harper's Ferry and looked out the window and said, "Do you know an oak like that takes 80 years to reach that size?" And she had answered him, "I know. I grew up watching it." She had been 23 years old and had not known yet that the answer she gave in that moment was the beginning of everything, that the man would turn from the window and find something in her face that would bring him back the following week, and the week after that, and eventually to a courthouse in March of 1973. And then to 50 years of a life built alongside hers, including 25 years of weekends in these mountains building something she would not find until he was gone. The oak outside Dreyer's pharmacy was still there. She knew because she had driven through Harper's Ferry the previous autumn, for no reason she could precisely articulate, and she had slowed the car on Main Street and looked at the tree through the window. And it had been exactly as she remembered it, larger by a year, which at that age and size meant unchanged to any eye that was not paying the closest possible attention, which is the point. 80 years to reach that size. And then continuing. Philip appeared at the edge of the clearing at 9:30, his field pack on his back and his notebook already in his hand, heading out for the morning survey. He raised a hand to Maggie as he crossed the clearing. She raised hers in return. Isabel came behind him a few minutes later, moving quickly in the direction of the northeastern sector, where the running cedar grew, carrying her collection equipment and wearing the expression she always wore when she was heading toward the work intent, already halfway there in her mind. Earl arrived at 10 with his Tuesday tools, as he had arrived every Tuesday for 30 years, and went directly to the south corner of the house, where a section of the roof overhang had been showing the early signs of weather wear, and he had decided last week that it needed attention. Ruth had sent a jar of preserved peaches from the summer canning with him, and he left it on the kitchen counter without comment. Because that was how Ruth communicated, through what she sent rather than what she said, and Maggie had learned to receive it the same way. In the afternoon, James and his younger brother would arrive with Heartland for the weekend. James had been corresponding with Philip about spiders in the week since his first visit. Actual letters written by hand on notebook paper and mailed to the university department address Philip had given him, which Philip answered with equal seriousness, and had a list of questions he had prepared about the specific species present on the property. The younger boy, who was 6 and had no particular scientific focus yet, but an enormous and indiscriminate enthusiasm for everything the forest contained, had asked Maggie on his last visit whether she thought there might be salamanders under the flat rock at the stream. She had told him she didn't know, but that they could look and find out, and he had spent the rest of that visit thinking about it with the concentrated anticipation of a child who has been given something to look forward to. She was looking forward to it too, This had surprised her at first how much she was looking forward to it, how much room these grandchildren had found in her without her having to create space for it. But then she had thought about it more and understood that whatever James and his brother took
When I was young,
the spider webs and the salamanders,
certain
and the
peace
particular
was
quality of
waiting
light
there.
all through
I thought the storms were wrong turns taken,
they would carry
and every
forward
burden was unfair. So I spent years fighting the mountains, cursing every winding road,
That was how
never seeing that the struggle was the
Maggie
thing
lifted
that
her coffee
made me
mug
grow.
and found it empty.
The eagle
She set it on
lies
the
within the
and
wind,
shipped
the
out
oak grows strong beneath the snow, and every soul that's worth becoming must walk where harder paths may go.
You have been thinking about that,
Never meant to be easy.
turning it the
The
way you
storm
turn
was
the
never
stone. You have found
meant to
interesting
pass. The waves were not there to stop me. They were there
Thomas
to
had
teach
written
me
it about
how to last. Every trial is part of the journey. Every scar
meant it
becomes a guide. The mountain is not
He
in
had
my
meant it
way. The mountain is the reason for the climb.
He had meant it. About the two of them, about a marriage that had lasted 40 years. Not because it was always fully understood,
I've known
but because
loss
it
that
was the
left me broken. I've known
they
fear
had
that
both
stole
been
my breath. I've known
it
nights so cold and
she
endless
believed he
I
had
could
meant it
barely
well.
take
She
one
had
step.
spent 50 years
Yet every wound became a teacher. Every failure left a mark, and every valley that I walked through placed another star within the dark. The river doesn't fight the canyon, it learns to carve its way ahead. What seems a wall to those who fear
But
it
she
becomes a
understood
path for those who tread. The road was never meant to be easy.
The necessity was only
Was never meant to
the thing
pass.
itself was
The waves
something
were not there to stop me. They were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey. Every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way. The mountain is the reason for
This
the
place.
climb.
and she, the buds on the orchid moved slightly,
For the climb.
barely perceptibly.
One day I stopped asking why me and started
Maggie Holt sat
asking
in the
what
chair
can I learn the moment
held the
I
note
embrace the fire.
and
The
looked at
fire
the forest
lost its power to burn.
And she
For
felt
every challenge holds a gift, though hidden from the eye. The obstacle and
Not because Thomas had
destination
arranged it, though he had.
were
Not
never
because the numbers had
separate
resolved in her
this time.
favor, though they had.
The
Not
road
because
was
their
never
sons had
meant
come
to
and
be
seen what their
easy.
father did.
The storm was never meant to end. The battles were not sent to break
Because
me.
this was hers.
They were sent
It had
to
always been
shape the
moving
man
toward
I am. Every trial is part of the journey. Every loss becomes
The orchid would
a
open
light.
now.
The mountain
It had
is
opened
not
every
in
October
my
for
way. The mountain is the reason I can rise. So when the thunder finds me again, and dark clouds gather in the sky, I'll greet them like old companions.
The birds moved through the canopy above the
They belong.
attending to their ordinary business, indifferent to anything so small as a human life and its complications. The light shifted its angle by the increment it shifts each day in mid-September, moving toward October at the pace things move when they are not being hurried. The forest did what forests do when they are healthy and old, and have been cared for by someone who understood what they needed. It continued, which is the whole of what is required. which is enough.